Relation Tales. Caleb had been with his wife Laya for a little over a decade. They'd married young back when life was simple, and dreams of building a life together overshadowed any doubts. Caleb ran a successful jewelry business with his brothers, a venture they started from scratch that had now become quite profitable. Laya, a literary enthusiast with a degree in creative writing, had opened her own café, a cozy book-filled retreat that attracted a steady flow of customers in the artsy district of their city. It was her sanctuary, a place she poured her heart and soul into. It all started innocently enough, at least in Caleb's eyes. Laya mentioned a new regular customer, a man named Merrick. Merrick was tall, dark-haired, and strikingly charismatic with an Eastern European accent that seemed to capture the attention of every woman in the room. He was a recent immigrant from Croatia, a former musician who now worked odd jobs while trying to establish himself. Laya laughed about his attempts to flirt with her, saying, "He's harmless, just lonely and charming in that way that makes him feel like a character from one of my books." Caleb brushed it off, trusting Laya completely. But as weeks went by, Merrick became a regular topic of their conversations at home. She shared tidbits about his background, how he'd escaped a complicated past and arrived in the US with barely anything but a guitar and his optimism. Caleb noticed how her eyes would light up when she talked about Mark's stories and his musical ambitions. It was a familiar sparkle, one Caleb had once been the source of. Then came the first subtle warning sign. Laya came home late one night. Her cheeks flushed as she recounted how Merrick had surprised her with a small bouquet of wild flowers, saying they reminded him of home. She assured Caleb it was nothing serious, just a small gesture of friendship. But Caleb felt a twinge of something he couldn't ignore. A few days later, Caleb decided to drop by the cafe unexpectedly, hoping to surprise Laya with lunch. As he entered, he saw her laughing at a corner table. Her attention focused on Merrick, who leaned in close, speaking in low, animated tones. Their heads were nearly touching. Caleb's heart sank, but he didn't confront her right away. He was torn between wanting to trust her and the undeniable feeling of unease growing within him. The dynamic at home shifted in subtle ways over the following weeks. Laya started staying late at the cafe more often, claiming she was working on some new ideas for the shop or needed to do some inventory work. Caleb noticed her phone was suddenly filled with new messages, though she never seemed eager to share who they were from. Once Caleb caught a glimpse of a message notification just as she locked her screen with practiced quickness. The message was from Merrick. A simple message, but loaded with implications. "Last night was unforgettable. See you tomorrow." Realizing that something was amiss, Caleb decided to keep his suspicions to himself for the time being. But every night, he wrestled with the idea of confronting Laya. Torn between the love they'd built over a decade and the unbearable weight of mistrust now looming over him. Finally, Caleb decided he couldn't ignore it any longer. One night, after Laya returned from working late, he asked her point blank if she developed feelings for Merrick. Laya initially laughed it off, calling his jealousy silly. But Caleb wasn't convinced. Desperate for honesty, he told her he needed her to end whatever connection she had with Merrick beyond polite cafe interactions. This confrontation only made things worse. Laya accused Caleb of stifling her friendships and being irrational. Their argument spiraled until Laya stormed off, slamming the door behind her. Caleb felt the ground beneath his feet shift, knowing that whatever they had was now hanging by a thread. The days that followed were tense, and Caleb could feel the widening gulf between him and Laya. Determined to understand what was happening, he grew more vigilant, observing her every move. He started noticing subtle but painful changes. Laya would smile absent-mindedly at her phone, spend more time dressing up before heading to the cafe, and most strikingly talk about everything except their relationship. Caleb's patience frayed with every unexplained late night and secretive phone notification. He'd often find himself driving aimlessly, hoping the long, quiet drives would somehow calm the storms of suspicion in his mind. But one night, his drive took him to the cafe. It was after hours. The lights dimmed and he could make out two silhouettes inside. Laya and Merrick. Through the window, he watched them talk. Merrick leaning forward with an intensity that made Caleb's stomach churn. Laya's face was soft, her smile genuine, her hand resting briefly on Mark's arm as if to reassure him. Caleb felt a sharp pang in his chest. It was as though he were seeing a version of Laya that had once belonged to him, now lost to someone else. He drove away, his mind reeling, realizing that their marriage was slipping further and further out of his grasp. Unable to handle the uncertainty, Caleb decided to confront Laya directly. That night, as they sat across from each other at the dinner table in strange silence, he finally spoke up. "Laya," he began, his voice heavy with a weight of weeks of unsaid words. "Are you in love with him?" Lila's fork paused mid-air and her eyes widened, taken aback. She set her fork down, folding her hands carefully, as though preparing herself. "Caleb Merrick he's been a good friend," she replied carefully. "He's new here. He doesn't have anyone, and I just stop it," Caleb interrupted, the words coming out more sharply than he intended. "I'm not blind, Laya. I see how you look at him, how you smile when you talk about him. If it's really nothing, prove it. Show me your phone." Lila's face went pale, and she recoiled as if struck. "How could you ask me that?" she whispered, her voice barely above a murmur. A sick realization settled over Caleb. She didn't want him to see. In the crushing silence that followed, he could almost hear the truth in her refusal. That night, Caleb moved to the guest bedroom, their unspoken truths lingering like ghosts in the house. The following morning, while Laya was out running errands, Caleb found her phone left carelessly on the kitchen counter. It felt like a forbidden door he was finally willing to open. With a trembling hand, he unlocked it. His heart raced as he scrolled through her messages. Each line of text another twist of the knife. The conversations between Laya and Merrick were agonizing to read. They spoke in poetic terms, exchanged playful banter, and confessed desires and dreams Caleb had never heard from her lips. Each message was like a love letter. A part of her Caleb had once known, now being shared with someone else. One message stood out. "You make me feel alive again," Laya had written. "I don't know how long I can keep pretending everything is okay with Caleb. I feel like I'm just existing." Caleb's hands shook as he read. He was torn between rage and heartbreak, struggling to process the depth of her betrayal. Yet, instead of confronting her immediately, he decided to be his time, watching as the story unfolded in front of him, hoping that this knowledge would give him the strength to make the right decision. Days passed and Caleb found himself in a haze, unable to function at work, his mind consumed by thoughts of Laya and Merrick. Finally, he reached out to an old friend, Dominic, who happened to be a lawyer. Caleb wanted advice, not just on the divorce he now knew was inevitable, but on how to protect himself financially and emotionally. Dominic listened, nodding solemnly, and laid out a plan that would ensure Laya's actions would not go without consequence. One evening, while Laya was out with Merrick, Caleb packed up her belongings in silence. He left her things neatly by the door along with a note that simply read, "I know everything. You have until the end of the week to move out." When Laya returned home, she found Caleb waiting in the living room, arms crossed, his expression stony. The sight of her packed belongings shocked her into silence. "Caleb, what is this?" she stammered. "This is the end," he replied coldly. "I know about you and Merrick. I've known for weeks. I was hoping you'd end things before it came to this, but clearly I was wrong." Laya's face crumpled and she fell to her knees, sobbing. She pleaded with him, claiming she hadn't meant to hurt him, that she'd gotten caught up in emotions she didn't understand. But Caleb was done with words. He'd already made up his mind. Caleb's anger had become a quiet, relentless fire, fueling him through the legal proceedings. Dominic had been right. With the evidence Caleb had gathered, he had grounds to ensure that Lilo wouldn't walk away with anything more than what she brought into their marriage. Caleb felt a grim satisfaction knowing she would lose the café. He'd been paying for the space, and now that she was no longer his responsibility, she couldn't keep it. Meanwhile, Laya was grappling with the fallout of her choices. Merrick, now no longer seeing her as the carefree, unavailable woman he'd once idealized, began to lose interest. Their relationship had been built on the thrill of secrecy, and without it, the reality of their situation became painfully clear. One afternoon, Caleb saw Merrick alone in the café. Without hesitation, he approached him, calmly, introducing himself. Merrick paused, recognizing Caleb instantly. But Caleb simply smiled, a polite, almost chilling smile. "Thank you, Merrick," he said. "You've made it easier than I ever imagined." Caleb didn't wait for a response. He turned and left, leaving Merrick to sit in the silence, understanding that he had not just ended one relationship, but had irreparably damaged two. Months passed and the pain of betrayal slowly dulled. Caleb had focused on himself, pouring his energy into his work, rebuilding his sense of self after the emotional wreckage Laya had left behind. Friends and family became his support network, and he began to find solace in small moments. Simple things he hadn't appreciated in years. He kept his distance from Laya, hearing through mutual acquaintances that she was struggling, her cafe facing closure, her life unraveling without the financial support Caleb had once provided. He found a certain poetic justice in it, but took no pleasure in her suffering. He'd moved on, now more concerned with rebuilding his life and finding peace. On one quiet evening, Caleb sat in his office, reflecting on the journey he'd been through. The betrayal had shattered him, but it had also forged a resilience he hadn't known he possessed. He realized that he was free. Free from the lies, the deception, and the painful memories of a love that had turned to ashes. For Caleb, the end of his marriage marked the beginning of a new chapter. One where he was finally able to live on his own terms, no longer tied to a past that had once defined him. Caleb's life settled into a rhythm that was unexpectedly calming. Days stretched into weeks, and with each passing moment, the hurt seemed to ease. Though his thoughts sometimes wandered back to his past with Laya, he learned to temper the pain with the satisfaction of having taken back control of his life. His jewelry business continued to thrive, and his brothers, aware of what had happened, were supportive in ways he hadn't anticipated. But one thing he hadn't anticipated was how isolated he'd feel in the aftermath of everything. Caleb's anger had kept him going for a time, but as the anger began to fade, he found himself wrestling with a feeling of emptiness. He realized that for better or worse, he'd shared a decade of his life with Laya. The future he'd envisioned was gone, and with it, the comfort of knowing where he was headed. At the encouragement of his friend Dominic, Caleb began attending a local support group for people who'd been through difficult divorces. Although initially hesitant, he found solace in hearing others' stories, some eerily similar to his own. Listening to others who had healed and rebuilt their lives gave him the strength he needed to do the same. Through these meetings, he met someone who would profoundly change the course of his life. Isla. Isla had an energy that immediately drew Caleb in. She was confident, witty, and had a resilience he admired. She'd gone through her own journey, leaving behind a toxic relationship and emerging stronger. Over coffee after one of their group meetings, they shared their stories with each other, both surprised at how naturally their conversation flowed. Isla was nothing like Laya. While Laya had been introspective and somewhat reserved, Isla was bold and open-hearted. Caleb found himself laughing more in that single afternoon with her than he had in the past year. As they talked about their dreams, failures, and the lessons they'd learned, he realized he hadn't felt this free in a long time. Isla was a painter who had just begun showing her work in small galleries around town. Her passion for art was contagious, and she spoke about her projects with a spark in her eyes that Caleb found invigorating. In the weeks that followed, he found himself spending more and more time with her, and with each meeting, the painful memories of his past faded a little more. One night, Caleb took Isla to his family's cabin, a quiet retreat nestled in the woods, where he often went to clear his mind. As they sat on the porch watching the stars, he opened up to her about his lingering fears. The fear of trusting someone again, of letting his guard down, of being hurt. Isla listened patiently, then reached over, taking his hand in hers. "You know, Caleb, life doesn't guarantee us immunity from pain, no matter how careful we are. But that's the beauty of it, too. It's about finding the right people to take those risks with. And I don't know about you, but I think that's worth a shot." For the first time in a long while, Caleb felt himself soften, his heart willing to let someone in again. That night, he decided that he was ready to take a chance on happiness once more. With Isla's encouragement, Caleb began exploring his creative side as well. Incorporating unique handcrafted designs into his jewelry line, inspired by their outings and the natural beauty they encountered together. His jewelry line quickly gained attention for its intricate nature-inspired pieces, and sales surged as Caleb poured his heart into his work. Seeing Caleb transform, his brothers couldn't have been happier. They marveled at his renewed sense of purpose and a noticeable glow he'd regained. They even threw a small celebration at the shop, marking his journey back from heartbreak to happiness. Meanwhile, Laya was struggling. Without Caleb's support, her cafe fell into debt, and she found herself overwhelmed. Merrick, who had promised her a future filled with adventure, quickly distanced himself, finding her troubles too burdensome. Laya watched as the man she had left Caleb for turned away. Her café faced foreclosure, and the world she'd built came crumbling down. Caleb, however, was no longer interested in her fate. For him, Laya had become a closed chapter, a lesson in resilience, and a reminder of what he wanted to avoid in future relationships. And though he sometimes caught himself wondering about her, he was always grateful to have moved on. Caleb's life with Isla blossomed naturally. They traveled together, exploring new places and finding inspiration in the beauty around them. Caleb's jewelry designs evolved, reflecting the love and trust he'd found again. He never imagined that he could rebuild a life more meaningful than the one he'd lost. But standing with Isla by his side, he realized he'd come out stronger, happier, and more at peace. One evening, as they stood in Isla's art gallery, now filled with both her paintings and his jewelry, Caleb took her hand and quietly asked her to stay by his side for the rest of his life. Isla's answer was immediate, and together they embraced the future that awaited them. For Caleb, the journey had been a painful one, but in the end, it had led him to a love and a life more genuine than he ever could have imagined. He had learned, healed, and rediscovered himself. And now he was finally free to live fully and fearlessly once